They looked at him like he was just another confused elderly passenger wandering through the wrong terminal. Gray hair, wrinkled shirt, shoes that had seen better decades. No first-class boarding pass, no frequent flyer status, just an old man. Shuffling through security with a battered leather briefcase that screamed retirement hobby. The TSA agent barely glanced up before deciding he needed extra screening. Started asking questions he couldn't answer fast enough, demanding documentation he didn't think to bring. Until the control tower's radio crackled with 5 words that changed everything. Air Force One requests immediate clearance. Want to know who he really was and why the most powerful plane in the world was asking for his permission to land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal C at Reagan National Airport, painting the polished floors in geometric patterns that shifted with each passing cloud. It was Tuesday, just after the morning rush, when the concourses settled into their mid-morning rhythm of business. Travelers checking phones and retirees moving at a more leisurely pace toward their gates. The air hummed with the constant background noise of rolling luggage, distant announcements, and the perpetual whoosh of air conditioning systems working overtime against the October heat. Frank Morrison stood in the TSA PreCheck line, though he'd never signed up for it. The agent at the checkpoint had directed him there after glancing at his boarding pass, making an assumption that would prove more complicated than anyone anticipated. His appearance suggested someone who'd earned a few conveniences over the years, silver hair combed carefully to one side, a face marked by decades of squinting into bright skies, hands that moved with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to handling delicate instruments. His clothes told a different story. The khaki slacks had been pressed once, maybe twice since their last wash. The blue button-down shirt carried the soft wrinkles of someone who'd packed in a hurry or simply stopped caring about crisp edges. His brown leather shoes had been resoled more than once, the kind of practical footwear that prioritized comfort over style. The only thing that seemed newer was the small American flag pin on his collar, though even that had developed a slight patina that suggested it wasn't purely decorative. He carried himself with the upright posture of someone who'd spent decades in uniform, though no uniform was visible today. His gait was steady but unhurried, the walk of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. The leather briefcase in his right hand was scarred with age, corners worn smooth by decades of handling, buckles that had been replaced at least once. It swung gently as he moved, clearly heavy but carried with the ease of long familiarity. TSA agent Jennifer Martinez had been working the PreCheck line for 3 years, long enough to develop a reliable sense for travelers who didn't quite fit the usual patterns. She'd processed thousands of passengers, from harried executives clutching multiple devices to elderly tourists clutching boarding passes like lifelines. She prided herself on efficiency, on moving people through the checkpoint with minimal fuss, while maintaining the security protocols that kept everyone safe. When Frank approached her station, something in his demeanor caught her attention. He moved with confidence, but without the aggressive impatience that characterized most frequent flyers. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't juggling multiple bags, wasn't displaying any of the usual signs of someone trying to catch a tight connection. He simply stood there, briefcase in hand, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Martinez glanced at his boarding pass, noting the destination, Andrews Air Force Base, a government flight, which explained the PreCheck routing, though she didn't recognize the airline code. Her computer screen showed his name, Frank Morrison, and a seat assignment, but no frequent flyer number, no TSA PreCheck enrollment, no global entry status. Just a basic booking that someone had flagged for expedited screening. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice carrying the practiced professionalism of someone who'd given this greeting thousands of times. "I'll need to see your ID along with Your boarding pass. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and produced a wallet that had seen better decades. The leather was worn smooth in places, cracked along the edges where it had been folded too many times. He extracted a driver's license and handed it over with the same unhurried precision that marked all his movements. Martinez examined the license, comparing the photo to the man standing in front of her. The picture showed the same face, perhaps a few years younger, with the same careful silver hair and steady gaze. The address was local, Virginia, which wasn't unusual for government flights out of Andrews. The license was current, properly updated, nothing that would raise any immediate flags. But something about the whole situation felt slightly off. The passenger was clearly older, probably in his 70s, traveling alone to a military base on what appeared to be a civilian booking. His clothes suggested someone who might be visiting family or attending some kind of ceremony. But there was something in his bearing that didn't quite match the profile of a typical retiree making a sentimental journey. "What's the purpose of your visit to Andrews today, Mr. Morrison?" Martinez asked, the question emerging more from curiosity than protocol. It wasn't required, but she'd learned that a simple question often revealed whether someone was comfortable with their travel plans or trying to hide something. Frank's expression remained neutral, though something flickered behind his eyes. "Official business," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight hoarseness that comes with age but also the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard over engine noise. Martinez waited for him to elaborate, but he simply stood there, patient and composed. The answer was technically sufficient but frustratingly vague. Official business could mean anything from a contractor meeting to a memorial service. It was the kind of response that satisfied protocol while revealing nothing meaningful. She handed back his license and boarding pass, then gestured toward the metal detector. "Please place your briefcase on the conveyor belt and step through when the light turns green." Frank moved to comply, lifting the briefcase onto the belt with both hands. The weight was clearly substantial, causing the conveyor to slow slightly as it began its journey through the X-ray machine. Martinez watched the screen as the image appeared, showing the briefcase's contents in the ghostly green and orange shadows. That revealed density and composition. What she saw made her pause. The briefcase wasn't filled with the usual business traveler necessities: laptop, documents, maybe a tablet and some cables. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, she could make out what appeared to be thick manuals, several bound volumes that seemed too substantial for casual reading. There were also some smaller objects that showed up as dense, metallic shapes, though their exact nature was unclear through the X-ray filter. "Sir, I'm going to need to take a look inside your briefcase," Martinez said, her tone shifting to something more official. It wasn't an accusation, just a routine request that happened dozens of times each day. But Frank's reaction was immediate and telling. He turned from the metal detector, his posture straightening in a way that suggested the request wasn't entirely unexpected. "Is there a problem, Agent Martinez?" he asked, reading her name tag with the same careful attention he'd given to every other detail of the interaction. "No problem, sir. Just a routine inspection. Some of the items in your bag aren't immediately identifiable on the screen." Frank nodded and stepped aside, allowing other passengers to continue through the checkpoint, while Martinez retrieved his briefcase from the conveyor belt. She carried it to a nearby inspection table, Frank following with the same unhurried pace that had marked his entire progress through the line. The briefcase was heavier than she'd expected, the leather warm from the X-ray machine's heat. The brass buckles were tarnished with age but still functional, opening with the solid click of quality hardware. As she lifted the lid, the first thing that struck her was the smell old leather, paper, and something else, something that reminded her of machine oil and metal polish. The contents were arranged with military precision. The thick manuals she'd seen on the X-ray were flight manuals, their covers bearing the official seals of various military branches. Some were clearly decades old, their pages yellowed with age but still in remarkable condition. Others looked more recent, though, still showing signs of heavy use. Beneath the manuals were several smaller items that had caught the X-ray operator's attention. A slide rule, its white plastic surface worn smooth by countless calculations. A vintage aviation calculator, the kind that had been state-of-the-art before computers made such tools obsolete. A compass, brass and heavy, with a face that had been polished by decades of handling. Each item was wrapped in soft cloth, protected with the care of someone who understood their value. Martinez lifted one of the flight manuals, noting the classification. Markings on the cover. Not classified in the sense of current state secrets, but restricted distribution. The kind of technical documentation that was controlled, but not necessarily sensitive. The date on the cover was from 1987, and the pages showed the wear patterns of someone who'd referenced specific sections repeatedly over many years. "These are some serious aviation manuals," she said, more to herself than to Frank. "Are you in the aircraft industry, Mr. Morrison?" Frank's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested the question touched on complicated territory. "I was for a while." The answer was characteristically brief, revealing little, while technically being truthful. Martinez had encountered similar responses from defense contractors, people who'd worked on classified projects and learned to be careful about what they said, even about work that was decades old. She continued her inspection, finding more evidence of a career spent around aircraft. A small logbook, its pages filled with entries in careful handwriting. Dates, aircraft tail numbers, flight times, all recorded with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized professional aviators. The entries seemed to span decades, starting with what appeared to be training flights and progressing through increasingly complex aircraft types. The logbook was personal property, not subject to detailed inspection, but Martinez couldn't help noticing the sheer volume of flight hours recorded. The numbers were staggering, representing a lifetime spent in the air. She'd seen similar logbooks from airline pilots, but something about the aircraft types and mission descriptions suggested a different kind of flying career. At the bottom of the briefcase, wrapped in a piece of faded blue fabric, was something that made Martinez pause. It was a medal, clearly military, with a ribbon that had faded from years of storage. The medal itself was substantial, heavier than the commemorative pieces that most veterans carried, and the ribbon bore the distinctive pattern of something significant. Martinez wasn't an expert on military decorations, but she'd seen enough to recognize that this wasn't a standard service medal. The weight, the craftsmanship, the distinctive design elements all suggested something that had been earned rather than simply awarded for participation. She rewrapped it carefully, respecting the obvious reverence with which it had been preserved. "You were military," she said, not really a question but an observation that seemed safe to make. Frank nodded once, a gesture that confirmed the obvious while volunteering nothing additional. "Air Force." The admission explained some of the items in the briefcase, but it also raised new questions. The flight manuals, the logbook, the navigation instruments, they suggested someone who'd been deeply involved in aviation, possibly at a high level. But Frank's current appearance, his civilian clothes, his humble demeanor, made it difficult to reconcile the evidence with the man standing in front of her. Martinez had encountered many veterans in her years at the checkpoint, and she'd learned to recognize the signs. The posture, the way they responded to authority, the careful way they answered questions. Frank displayed all of these characteristics, but there was something else, something that suggested his military service might have been more significant than his current appearance indicated. She began repacking the briefcase, taking care to arrange the items in the same order she'd found them. The manuals went back first, then the instruments, each wrapped in its protective cloth. The logbook went into its designated pocket, and the medal was returned to its place of honor at the bottom of the case. As she worked, Martinez became aware that other passengers were beginning to notice the extended inspection. A businessman in expensive suit was glancing at his watch with growing impatience. A young mother with 2 children was shifting nervously, clearly worried about making her flight. The normal rhythm of the checkpoint was being disrupted by the time she was taking with Frank's belongings. "I apologize for the delay, Mr. Morrison," she said, closing the briefcase and securing the buckles. "Everything appears to be in order." Frank accepted the briefcase with both hands, the weight settling into his grip with familiar ease. "Thank you, Agent Martinez. I understand. You're just doing your job." There was no irritation in his voice, no sense that he'd been inconvenienced or embarrassed by the inspection. He simply stood there, waiting for whatever came next, with the same patient composure that had characterized the entire interaction. Martinez found herself reluctant to simply wave him through. Something about the situation felt unfinished, as if she'd glimpsed something important without fully understanding its significance. The flight manuals, the logbook, the medal, they painted a picture of someone who'd had a distinguished career in aviation, possibly in roles that were more significant than his current appearance suggested. But protocol was protocol, and she'd found nothing that warranted further inspection. Frank's identification was valid, his boarding pass was legitimate, and his belongings, while unusual, contained nothing that violated security regulations. There was no justification for detaining him further, no matter how curious she might be about his background. "Have a safe flight, sir," she said, stepping aside to allow him to proceed to his gate. Frank nodded his thanks and moved toward the exit of the security checkpoint, his pace unhurried despite the time that had been spent on the inspection. Martinez watched him go, noting the way other passengers seemed to barely notice him, just another elderly traveler making his way through the terminal. She turned back to the checkpoint, ready to process the next passenger in line, but found herself glancing back toward Frank's retreating figure. Something about the entire interaction had left her with questions that proper protocol prevented her from asking. Who was Frank Morrison? What kind of official business was he conducting at Andrews Air Force Base? And why did someone with his apparent background choose to travel in such humble circumstances? The answers would have to wait. The checkpoint was busy, other passengers were waiting, and Martinez had a job to do. But as she called the next traveler forward, she made a mental note to remember the name Frank Morrison, just in case it ever came up again. Frank continued through the terminal, moving with the same steady pace that had carried him through the security checkpoint. His briefcase felt heavier now, not because of its contents, but because of the attention it had drawn. He'd expected some curiosity about his travel plans, but the extended inspection had been more thorough than he'd anticipated. He found his gate without difficulty, settling into one of the chairs near the boarding area. The flight to Andrews wasn't scheduled to depart for another hour, giving him time to review the materials in his briefcase one more time. But as he sat there, watching the other passengers go about their business, he couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's interaction at the security checkpoint was just the beginning of a much longer day. The terminal around him continued its familiar rhythm of arrivals and departures, announcements and delays, the constant flow of people moving between destinations. But Frank Morrison sat quietly in his chair, a man whose past was about to collide with his present in ways that neither he nor anyone else in the terminal could possibly anticipate. Outside on the tarmac, aircraft taxied between gates and runways, their engines creating the background symphony of modern aviation. Controllers in the tower managed the complex dance of takeoffs and landings, their voices crackling over radio frequencies that carried the constant chatter of commercial aviation. It was a world that Frank knew intimately, though from a perspective that few people in the terminal would ever understand. And somewhere in that controlled chaos, A very special aircraft was preparing for a flight that would bring Frank Morrison's carefully guarded past into sudden, unavoidable focus. The gate area for the Andrews Air Force Base flight was unusually quiet compared to the bustling commercial terminal surrounding it. Only a handful of passengers waited in the designated seating area, most of them carrying the subdued demeanor of people traveling on government business. A few wore civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise their military bearing, while others carried briefcases and documents that suggested contractor meetings or administrative duties. Frank Morrison had chosen a seat near the large windows, overlooking the tarmac, where he could watch the constant ballet of aircraft movements. From this vantage point, he could see the control tower in the distance, its windows reflecting the morning sun like a beacon overseeing the complex choreography of departures and arrivals. The familiar sights and sounds of an active airport brought back memories that he'd learned to keep carefully compartmentalized, echoes of a career that had taken him to airports around the world, under circumstances very different from today's simple government flight. Agent Martinez's inspection had been thorough but respectful, and Frank found himself appreciating her professionalism even as it had delayed his progress through the checkpoint. She'd handled his belongings with care, recognizing their obvious importance without pressing for details that he wasn't prepared to share. The flight manuals, the logbook, the navigation instruments, they were more than professional tools. They were tangible connections to a life spent in service to something larger than himself. He opened his briefcase again, not because he needed to review the contents, but because the familiar ritual of checking and arranging his materials helped center his thoughts. The morning had already presented one unexpected challenge, and experience had taught him to be prepared for others. The metals at the bottom of the case caught the light streaming through the terminal windows, their ribbons faded but their significance undiminished by the passage of years. 20 yards away, near the customer service counter, airport operations, Supervisor Daniel Kowalski was reviewing the morning's flight manifest on his tablet. Kowalski had worked at Reagan National for 8 years, long enough to develop a comprehensive understanding of the facility's daily rhythms and the various types of flights that moved through its gates. Government flights to Andrews were routine, typically carrying military personnel, defense contractors, or federal employees on official business. But something about today's Andrews flight had caught his attention during the morning briefing. The passenger manifest was shorter than usual, and the aircraft assigned to the route was a smaller government transport rather than the standard commercial carrier that usually handled the run. More interesting was a note in the flight coordination system indicating that the flight had been given priority routing and expedited ground handling, suggestions that someone important was traveling. Kowalski glanced toward the gate area, his eyes sweeping across the waiting passengers. Most looked exactly like what he'd expect for a government flight: middle-aged professionals in business attire, a few younger people who might be junior staff or contractors, and one elderly gentleman sitting alone near the windows. Nothing obviously out of the ordinary, but the priority handling note continued to puzzle him. His radio crackled with a transmission from the control tower, the voice of air traffic controller Sarah Chun cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal. Operations, be advised we have an unscheduled priority aircraft requesting approach. Clearance, estimated arrival in approximately 40 minutes. Kowalski pressed the talk button on his radio. Tower, operations here. Do we have gate space available for priority arrival? Chun's voice came back immediately, negative on gate space. This aircraft will require special parking arrangement. Stand by for further instructions. Priority aircraft weren't unusual at Reagan National, given its proximity to the nation's capital and the frequency of government flights. But unscheduled priority arrivals during peak morning hours typically required coordination that would have started hours earlier. Whatever aircraft was requesting clearance had either developed an emergency situation or was operating under protocols that superseded normal scheduling procedures. Kowalski made a note in his tablet and continued reviewing the morning's operations. The Andrews flight was scheduled to depart in 30 minutes, well before the mysterious priority aircraft was due to arrive. With luck, whatever was developing would resolve itself without impacting the routine government flights that formed the backbone of his daily operations schedule. Frank Morrison checked his watch, a simple analog timepiece that had served him faithfully for decades. The flight would begin boarding soon, and he wanted to review one particular section of the flight manual that had been weighing on his mind since receiving the call that had prompted today's journey. The call had been brief, professional, and carefully worded to avoid specifics that weren't appropriate for unsecured phone lines. But the underlying message had been clear. His expertise was needed for a situation that couldn't wait for normal bureaucratic processes. He found the relevant section in the manual, pages that detailed emergency protocols for aircraft operating in restricted airspace. The procedures hadn't changed significantly since his active duty days, but technology had advanced enough to make some of the older protocols seem quaint by comparison. Still, the fundamental principles remained the same: clear communication, precise navigation, and absolute adherence to established safety procedures. A young woman in a Navy uniform approached the gate area, her stride purposeful but not hurried. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility, her service dress uniform immaculate despite the early hour. She'd driven down from the Pentagon for this flight, leaving her apartment in Arlington before dawn to ensure she wouldn't miss what had been described as an essential briefing at Andrews. Torres had been working in naval aviation logistics for 3 years, long enough to understand that unscheduled briefings usually meant either crisis management or opportunity. Her commanding officer had been characteristically vague about the purpose of today's meeting, mentioning only that her expertise in aircraft coordination would be valuable for a developing situation. The fact that she'd been specifically requested by name suggested that someone with significant authority was taking a personal interest in whatever was developing. She chose a seat across from Frank Morrison, noting the elderly gentleman's obvious familiarity with the aviation materials spread across his lap. The flight manuals were clearly military issue, their conditions suggesting years of practical use rather than casual study. Torres had seen similar manuals throughout her career, but something about the specific editions Frank was reviewing caught her attention. They were older than what she was accustomed to seeing, representing aircraft and procedures that predated her own military service. Frank became aware of the young officer's presence without looking up from his manual. Years of experience had taught him to maintain awareness of his surroundings even when focused on specific tasks, a habit that had served him well in environments where situational awareness could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. He could sense her curiosity about his materials, but also her professional restraint in not intruding on a stranger's privacy. Their mutual awareness was interrupted by an announcement over the terminal's public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience, but Flight 447 to Andrews Air Force Base will be delayed approximately 20 minutes due to air traffic control requirements. We will begin boarding as soon as clearance is received. Thank you for your patience." Torres checked her watch, calculating whether the delay would impact her scheduled briefing at Andrews. 20 minutes wasn't catastrophic, but it would compress her timeline for reviewing materials before the meeting. She pulled out her phone to send a quick text updating her arrival time, then noticed that Frank Morrison was closing his briefcase with what appeared to be resignation rather than frustration. "Traveling to Andrews on business?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral but friendly. Frank looked up, taking in her uniform and the quiet confidence that marked her as someone accustomed to military environments. "Official business," he replied, echoing his earlier response to Agent Martinez's similar question. Torres nodded, recognizing the careful phrasing that government employees used when discussing work that might be sensitive. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Torres, Navy, Logistics Coordination." "Frank Morrison," he replied, extending his hand in greeting, "Retired Air Force." The handshake was firm but brief, each person maintaining the professional courtesy that characterized interactions between military personnel of different generations. Torres found herself curious about Frank's background, particularly given the obvious depth of his aviation materials. But experience had taught her that retired personnel often preferred not to discuss their service unless specifically invited to do so. Meanwhile, in the airport's operations center, Supervisor Kowalski was receiving increasingly urgent communications from the control tower. The unscheduled priority aircraft was maintaining its approach trajectory, but its identity remained classified at a level that exceeded his clearance. What he could determine was that the aircraft required not just priority landing clearance, but also specialized ground handling that would tie up significant airport resources. "Tower operations," Kowalski spoke into his radio. "I need to know the nature of this priority aircraft to properly coordinate ground support." Controller Chun's voice crackled back with a tension that hadn't been present in her earlier transmissions. "Operations. Tower. Priority aircraft is requesting direct communication with airport authority regarding passenger coordination. Stand by for patch-through." Before Kowalski could respond, his radio frequency was suddenly occupied by a new voice. One speaking with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Reagan Operations, this is Air Force One requesting immediate coordination for passenger pickup at your facility." The words hit Kowalski like a physical blow. Air Force One, the President's aircraft, not only was the most important airplane in the world requesting access to his airport, but it was specifically asking for passenger coordination. That meant someone currently at Reagan National was important enough to warrant a presidential aircraft pickup, someone whose identity and mission were classified far above Kowalski's security clearance. He forced himself to respond professionally. Despite the adrenaline surge that threatened to overwhelm his training, "Air Force One, Reagan Operations. We copy your request for passenger coordination. Please stand by while we coordinate with appropriate security agencies." "Negative, Reagan Operations. Time is critical. We need immediate identification of passenger Frank Morrison, currently in your terminal awaiting government transport to Andrews Air Force Base. Presidential directive requires his immediate transportation aboard this aircraft." Kowalski's hands were shaking as he reached for his tablet to access the passenger manifests. Frank Morrison. The name wasn't familiar, but the fact that Air Force One was specifically requesting this individual suggested a level of importance that defied easy categorization. He quickly located the Andrews flight manifest and confirmed that Frank Morrison was indeed listed as a passenger, scheduled to depart in less than 20 minutes. "Air Force One, Reagan Operations confirms passenger Frank Morrison is present at Gate C7, currently awaiting departure on scheduled government flight to Andrews. What are your instructions for coordination?" The response was immediate and left no room for interpretation. "Reagan Operations, cancel the Andrews flight. For passenger Morrison, coordinate immediate escort to secure holding area for presidential transport. This directive comes with highest national security priority." "Acknowledge." Kowalski's mind raced through the implications of what he was hearing. Somewhere in his terminal was a man important enough to warrant personal transportation aboard the president's aircraft. Yet this individual had apparently been traveling as a routine passenger on a standard government flight. The disconnect between Morrison's apparent low profile and the extraordinary resources being deployed for his transportation suggested either a security situation or a matter of such importance that normal protocols were being bypassed entirely. "Air Force One, Reagan Operations acknowledges highest priority directive. Initiating passenger coordination and security escort immediately. ETA for passenger delivery to aircraft. Reagan operations, Air Force One is 15 minutes out. Have passenger Morrison ready for immediate boarding upon our arrival. Presidential security detail will coordinate directly with your airport security for transfer protocols. The radio fell silent, leaving Kowalski staring at his tablet screen where Frank Morrison's name appeared in simple black text, offering no hint of why the most powerful man in the world had just disrupted his aircraft's schedule to personally collect this passenger. He reached for his phone to contact airport security, knowing that the next 15 minutes would either be the most important of his career or the most catastrophic. Back at gate C7, Frank Morrison was reviewing approach charts when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number wasn't immediately familiar, but the area code suggested a Washington location. He answered with his customary brevity. Morrison. Mr. Morrison, this is Colonel Patricia Williams, Presidential Military Office. Sir, we need you to remain exactly where you are. Do not proceed to your scheduled flight. Security personnel will be contacting you within minutes for immediate escort to alternative transportation. Do you understand these instructions? Frank felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied unexpected changes to carefully planned operations. Colonel, I understand. Should I expect any specific identification from the security personnel? Sir, they will identify themselves with code word Starlifter. Please gather your belongings and be prepared for immediate departure. The line went dead, leaving Frank staring at his phone with the growing realization that whatever situation had prompted today's journey to Andrews had just escalated far beyond anything he'd anticipated. Starlifter wasn't just a random code word. It was the designation of the aircraft he'd flown for the better part of 2 decades, a reference that only someone with access to his classified service records would know to use. Lieutenant Commander. Torres had overheard enough of the conversation to recognize the tone of urgency, if not the specific content. Frank's entire demeanor had shifted from the relaxed posture of a passenger waiting for a routine flight to the alert readiness of someone receiving emergency instructions. Is everything all right? She asked, her military training overriding normal civilian courtesy in the face of what appeared to be developing crisis. Frank looked at her for a moment, weighing how much he could safely share with someone he'd just met, regardless of her military status. Change of plans, he said finally. Looks like I won't be taking the Andrews flight after all. Before Torres could respond, 2 men in dark suits approached the gate area with the purposeful stride of federal law enforcement. They moved with the coordinated precision of a team that had worked together extensively, their eyes constantly scanning the area while maintaining focus on their primary objective. The taller of the 2 men spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to compliance. Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent David Park, Secret Service. This is Agent Michael Santos. We need you to come with us immediately. Frank stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. Code word verification? Agent Park's expression didn't change, but Frank could see a flicker of respect in his eyes. Starlifter, sir. Frank nodded and reached for his briefcase, the weight settling into his hand with familiar comfort. Around the gate area, other passengers were beginning to notice the unusual activity, though their curiosity was tempered by the obvious authority radiating from the federal agents. Lieutenant Commander Torres watched the scene unfold with growing concern, her military experience telling her that whatever was happening involved much more than a simple change in travel arrangements. Gentlemen, Frank said, addressing the Secret Service agents with the same calm professionalism he'd maintained throughout the morning's unexpected developments. I'm ready. Agent Park gestured toward the terminal exit, his partner already moving to establish a security perimeter around their small group. As they began walking, Frank could hear Supervisor Kowalski's voice over the terminal's announcement system. Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 447 to Andrews Air Force Base has been canceled due to operational requirements. Passengers should report to the customer service counter for rebooking assistance. We apologize for any inconvenience. The announcement prompted a chorus of frustrated complaints from the waiting passengers, but Frank Morrison was no longer listening. He was focused entirely on the walk through the terminal, flanked by federal agents who were escorting him toward a rendezvous with the most important aircraft in the world. His past, which he'd spent decades keeping carefully private, was about to become the center of national attention in ways he never could have anticipated. Outside on the tarmac, ground crews were clearing a special parking area as the distinctive blue and white aircraft approached Reagan National Airport. The sight of Air Force One coming in for an unscheduled landing was already attracting attention from aviation enthusiasts and airport workers alike, though none of them could possibly guess that the plane's unusual destination was connected to an elderly man who'd started the day as just another passenger trying to catch a routine government flight. The next few minutes would transform Frank Morrison from a retired Air Force officer traveling on obscure official business into someone whose expertise was so critical that the President of the United States had personally redirected Air Force One to collect him. But first, he had to navigate the security protocols that surrounded any movement of the presidential aircraft, protocols that would soon reveal to everyone present just how extraordinary his background really was. The walk through Reagan National's secure corridors felt different from any Frank Morrison had taken in decades. Agent Park maintained position slightly ahead and to his left, while Agent Santos covered the rear, their movements synchronized with the precision of a team that had rehearsed these protocols countless times. Airport security personnel appeared at regular intervals, creating a moving bubble of protection that drew curious stares from travelers and airport staff alike. Frank carried his briefcase with the same steady grip he'd maintained all morning, but now the weight seemed to carry additional significance. The manuals, logbooks, and instruments inside weren't just personal memorabilia anymore. They were about to become relevant to whatever crisis had prompted the President's aircraft to make an unscheduled stop at a civilian airport. The irony wasn't lost on him that items he'd carried through routine security screening just hours earlier were now being escorted by federal agents toward the most secure aircraft in the world. The secure access tunnel led to a restricted area of the tarmac normally reserved for government aircraft and emergency operations. Through the reinforced windows, Frank could see ground crews establishing a security perimeter around the designated parking area, their movements coordinated by supervisors speaking into encrypted radios. The level of activity suggested preparations for something far more significant than a routine government flight. Agent Park's radio crackled with updates from the approaching aircraft. Crown is 2 minutes out. Passengers secured and moving to designated pickup point. All ground personnel maintain security posture until departure. Frank recognized the terminology from his own years in military aviation. Crown was the Secret Service code name for Air Force One when the President was aboard, and the precise timing updates indicated that every second of this operation had been calculated to minimize exposure and maximize security. The fact that a presidential aircraft was being diverted to collect him suggested either an extraordinary emergency or a situation where his specific expertise was considered irreplaceable. The tarmac access door opened with a heavy mechanical sound, revealing the full scope of the security operation taking place outside. Frank counted at least 20 personnel in various positions around the designated landing area, from Secret Service agents to airport security to what appeared to be military communications specialists. The coordination was flawless, each person focused on their specific role in an operation that had clearly been planned and executed at the highest levels of government. Then he saw it approaching from the southwest, the distinctive blue and white Boeing 747 that served as Air Force One. its massive form cutting through the morning sky with the authority that came from carrying the most powerful office in the world. The aircraft's approach was different from the commercial flights Frank had watched all morning. There was a precision and purposefulness to its movement that spoke of pilots operating under priorities that superseded normal air traffic considerations. Lieutenant Commander Torres had managed to position herself near one of the terminal windows, overlooking the tarmac. Her earlier concern about Frank Morrison now transformed into fascination as she watched the unprecedented scene unfolding below. The elderly gentleman who'd been reviewing flight manuals just minutes earlier was now the center of a presidential-level security operation. Her military training told her she was witnessing something that would likely remain classified for decades, an intersection of national security and individual expertise that happened perhaps once in a generation. Airport Operations Supervisor Kowalski was coordinating ground support from the control tower, his radio active with constant updates from multiple agencies. The complexity of managing Air Force One's unscheduled arrival while maintaining normal airport operations was testing every system and protocol Reagan National had in place. But what struck him most was the precision with which every element of the operation was being executed. This wasn't an emergency response. It was a planned extraction that had been set in motion the moment someone determined that Frank Morrison's presence was required elsewhere. Air Force One touched down with the gentle precision that characterized presidential aircraft operations, its massive tires making contact with the runway in a landing so smooth it seemed to barely disturb the morning air. The aircraft taxied toward the designated parking area with the measured pace of something that never hurried but never wasted time. Ground crews moving in coordinated patterns to establish the security perimeter that would surround it during its brief stop. Frank watched the approach through the tarmac access windows, his expression unchanged but his mind calculating details that decades of aviation experience had trained him to notice automatically. The approach angle, the timing of the flare, the precisely controlled deceleration, everything about the landing spoke of pilots operating at the absolute top of their profession. Flying an aircraft where margin for error simply didn't exist. Agent Park received confirmation through his earpiece that the aircraft was secure and ready for passenger transfer. Mr. Morrison will be moving to the aircraft in approximately 2 minutes. Once we begin the approach, please maintain position between Agent Santos and myself until we reach the boarding stairs. Frank nodded his understanding, the familiar protocols triggering muscle memory from his own years of operating in high-security environments. The briefcase felt heavier in his hand now, not because of its physical weight, but because of the growing realization that whatever crisis had prompted this extraordinary extraction was about to become his responsibility to help resolve. The aircraft's engines wound down to a low idle, their massive turbofans creating a background hum that Frank recognized from decades of working around similar aircraft. Ground crews were already positioning the mobile stairs that would provide access to Air Force One's forward entrance, their movements coordinated by hand signals from security personnel who maintained constant radio contact with the aircraft's crew. Through the aircraft's windows, Frank could see movement as the crew prepared for the brief passenger pickup that had necessitated this unscheduled stop. The fact that the president's aircraft had been diverted from whatever original mission it had been flying spoke to the urgency of the situation Frank was being called to address. In his experience, such decisions were made only when normal bureaucratic channels were insufficient to handle developing crises. Agent Santos opened the tarmac access door, and the morning air rushed in carrying the familiar sounds and smells of an active airport. Jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic scent of aircraft exhaust mixed with the cooler morning air to create an atmosphere that Frank had breathed thousands of times throughout his career. But this time, the familiar environment was charged with tension and urgency that made everything feel different. The walk across the tarmac to Air Force One was surreal in its combination of routine security procedures and extraordinary circumstances. Frank had approached countless aircraft over the years, but none had carried the symbolic and practical authority of the plane waiting ahead of him. The blue and white livery caught the morning sunlight, and the presidential seal was clearly visible on the fuselage, a reminder that he was about to board not just an aircraft, but a flying symbol of American power and authority. As they climbed the mobile stairs to the aircraft's entrance, Frank could see Air Force personnel positioning themselves at key points around the security perimeter. The coordination was flawless, each person executing their role with the precision that characterized operations involving presidential aircraft. At the top of the stairs, a member of the presidential aircrew waited to escort him inside, her uniform bearing the patches and insignia that marked her as part of the elite unit responsible for Air Force One operations. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Major Patricia Chun, Deputy Aircraft Commander. Please come aboard, sir. The President is waiting to speak with you." Frank paused at the threshold of the aircraft, the significance of the moment settling over him like a familiar weight. Somewhere inside this aircraft, the President of the United States was waiting to discuss a situation that required Frank's specific expertise urgently enough to justify diverting Air Force One from its scheduled mission. The career he'd spent decades keeping private was about to become the center of the most important conversation he'd had since retiring from active duty. The interior of Air Force One was everything he'd heard it would be, and nothing like he'd expected. The forward section where he was escorted combined the functional efficiency of a military aircraft with the dignity appropriate to the presidency. Communications equipment lined bulkheads alongside more traditional executive furnishings, creating an environment that could serve as both command center and diplomatic meeting space as circumstances required. Major Chun guided him through a brief security screening conducted by Secret Service agents aboard the aircraft, a procedure that involved confirming his identity through biometric scanners and verification of the materials in his briefcase. The inspection was thorough but respectful, clearly conducted by personnel who understood the significance of whatever mission Frank was being recruited to support. President Robert Harrison emerged from the aircraft's central conference area. As Frank completed the security procedures, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere in the forward cabin. Frank had seen countless photographs and television appearances over the years, but meeting the president in person on his aircraft carried a weight and immediacy that no media coverage could convey. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for agreeing to this rather unusual travel arrangement. I'm President Harrison, and I apologize for the dramatic nature of your transportation, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Frank stood at attention, the posture automatic after decades of military service. "Mr. President, I'm honored to serve in whatever capacity you require." President Harrison gestured toward the conference area, where several other individuals were waiting around a table covered with documents, charts, and what appeared to be satellite imagery. "Frank, may I call you Frank? We have a situation developing that requires the expertise of someone with your specific background. Before we begin the briefing, I want you to understand that everything we discuss in the next few minutes is classified at the highest levels of national security." Frank nodded his understanding as they entered the conference area, where he was introduced to the other participants in what was clearly a crisis management meeting being conducted at 30,000 feet. Secretary of Defense Margaret Kowalski sat across from CIA Director James Patterson, while Air Force Chief of Staff General Robert Martinez reviewed what appeared to be operational maps spread across the table surface. "Frank," President Harrison began, settling into his chair at the head of the table, "3 hours ago, we lost contact with a classified reconnaissance aircraft operating in international airspace over the Pacific. The aircraft was conducting A highly sensitive intelligence-gathering mission when it disappeared from all tracking systems simultaneously. Frank felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied discussions of missing aircraft and endangered crews. "Mr. President, what type of aircraft are we discussing?" Secretary Kowalski answered, her voice carrying the weight of someone briefing on a situation that had consumed her morning. "The aircraft is a modified SR-91 Aurora, one of only 3 such aircraft in existence. It was operating under deep cover. Protocols when all communication ceased approximately 6 hours into a 12-hour mission." Frank's expression remained neutral, but internally he was processing implications that the others around the table might not fully appreciate. The SR-91 program had been classified beyond his clearance level during his active duty years, but he'd heard enough rumors and speculation to understand that any aircraft carrying that designation represented technology that couldn't be allowed to fall into hostile hands. CIA Director Patterson leaned forward, his expression grave. "Frank, the aircraft was carrying sensor packages and communications equipment that represent some of our most advanced intelligence capabilities. If that technology is compromised, it could set back our intelligence operations by decades and potentially expose assets around the world." President Harrison picked up the briefing, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect national security for years too. "Come. We have approximately 18 hours before hostile forces in the area will be able to mount a comprehensive search operation. If we're going to recover that aircraft and its crew, we need to locate it and execute a retrieval mission before that window closes." Frank studied the maps and satellite imagery spread across the table, his mind automatically processing the operational challenges involved in locating and recovering a missing aircraft in one of the most remote areas of the Pacific Ocean. The distances involved, the weather conditions, and the proximity of hostile forces created a problem set that would challenge even the most experienced rescue operations specialists. "Mr. President," Frank said carefully, "I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, but I've been retired from active duty for over 15 years. Surely there are current personnel with more recent experience in these types of operations." General Martinez spoke for the first time since Frank had entered the conference area, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in military aviation. "Frank, there aren't. The SR-91 program was so classified that only a handful of pilots ever flew missions with that aircraft type. Of those pilots, you're the only one with extensive experience in Pacific recovery operations, and the only one with the specific skill set we need for this mission." The weight of the situation began to settle over Frank as he realized that his decades of carefully guarded expertise were about to become the foundation for a mission that could determine whether critical American intelligence capabilities remained secure or fell into hostile hands. The flight manuals, logbooks, and navigation instruments in his briefcase suddenly took on new significance as reference materials for a mission he'd never expected to fly. Secretary Kowalski spread additional charts across the table, showing the vast expanse of Pacific Ocean where the missing aircraft had last been detected. "Our best estimate puts the SR-91 somewhere in this area, approximately 800 miles southwest of Midway Island. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and we have intelligence suggesting that hostile naval forces are beginning to move assets toward the region." Frank studied the charts with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized his approach to flight planning throughout his career. The search area was enormous, the weather conditions were challenging, and the time constraints made the mission exponentially more difficult. But as he examined the operational parameters, he began to see patterns and possibilities that his decades of experience in similar environments had trained him to recognize. "Mr. President, what aircraft assets do we have available for the recovery mission?" Frank asked, his mind already beginning to work through the logistics of mounting a search and rescue operation in such a remote location. President Harrison. exchanged glances with the other officials around the table before responding. "Frank, we have a specially modified C-130 Hercules standing by at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. The aircraft has been equipped with extended-range fuel tanks and specialized search equipment. That should give us the capability to reach the search area and conduct sustained operations." Frank nodded, recognizing the aircraft type and understanding its capabilities for the kind of long-range mission they were describing. The C-130 was reliable, versatile, and could operate from minimal airfields if necessary, making it an ideal platform for Pacific search operations. But success would depend entirely on the skill and experience of the crew assigned to fly the mission. "Who's been designated as the mission commander?" Frank asked, though something in the expressions around the table suggested he already knew the answer. General Martinez met his gaze directly. "Frank, you are. You're the only pilot we have with both the technical expertise to understand the SR-91 systems and the operational experience to command a search mission in that environment. The President has personally authorized your reactivation to active duty for this mission." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Reactivation to active duty. After 15 years of retirement, after building a carefully quiet life away from the pressures and responsibilities of military service, he was being called back to command. A mission that could determine the security of American intelligence operations worldwide. The weight of that responsibility settled over his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. "Mr. President," Frank said slowly, "I'm honored by your confidence, but I need to understand the full scope of what you're asking. This isn't just a search and rescue mission. It's a race against time to prevent our most advanced technology from falling into hostile hands." President Harrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "Frank, that's exactly what it is. And you're the only person we have who can give us a realistic chance of success. The crew of that SR-91 includes some of our best people, and the technology aboard that aircraft represents years of development and billions of dollars in research. If we lose both, it will be a catastrophic blow to American intelligence capabilities." Frank looked around the table at the faces of the nation's senior leadership, all of them focused on him with the expectation that he would accept the mission. That would test every skill he'd developed over decades of military service. The briefcase at his feet contained the tools and knowledge he'd need to plan and execute such a mission, but success would require more than technical expertise. It would require the kind of leadership and decision-making that had defined the most challenging moments of his career. CIA Director Patterson opened a folder and spread additional photographs across the table, satellite images that showed weather patterns developing across the search area. "Frank, we estimate that you have approximately 6 hours of clear weather before conditions deteriorate to the point where search operations become impossible. After that, we're looking at a 48-hour storm system that will make any recovery attempts extremely dangerous." The photographs confirmed Frank's assessment of the operational challenges they were facing. The storm system was massive, covering thousands of square miles of ocean with conditions that would ground even the most capable aircraft. If they were going to find the missing SR-91 and its crew, they had to do it before that weather system made the search area inaccessible. "Mr. President, if I accept this mission, I'll need complete operational authority over all aspects of the search and recovery effort. I'll also need access to whatever intelligence you have about the aircraft's last known position and the nature of its mission." President Harrison nodded immediately. "Done. You'll have everything we have, and you'll have my personal authorization to requisition whatever resources you need to complete the mission. The only constraint is time." Frank stood and walked to the aircraft's windows, looking out at the landscape passing below as Air Force One continued toward its destination. Somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, American aircrew members were either awaiting rescue or already beyond help, and technology that could affect national security for decades was either recoverable or lost forever. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine which of those possibilities became reality. He turned back to face the president and the assembled officials, his expression reflecting the weight of the commitment he was about to make. "Mr. President, I accept the mission. When do we begin?" The transformation in the conference room was immediate and electric. President Harrison stood and extended his hand, his grip firm and his expression reflecting both relief and determination. "Frank, welcome back to active duty. General Martinez will coordinate your transportation to Hawaii and provide whatever support you need for mission planning." Secretary Kowalski was already reaching for encrypted communication equipment to begin coordinating the resources Frank would need for the mission. CIA Director Patterson opened additional classified folders, preparing to brief Frank on intelligence details that would help guide his search efforts. The carefully orchestrated crisis management that had brought Frank aboard Air Force One was transitioning into operational planning for one of the most challenging missions any of them had ever attempted. Frank returned to his seat and opened his briefcase, the familiar weight of the flight manuals and navigation instruments now carrying the significance of tools that would be essential for mission success. The SR-91 recovery operation would test every skill he'd developed over decades of military service, but it would also provide an opportunity to serve his country in a way that only he could. As Air Force One began its descent toward Hawaii, where a specially equipped C-130 Hercules waited to carry Frank and his hastily assembled crew toward one of the most remote and dangerous search areas in the Pacific Ocean, the retired Air Force officer who'd started the day as just another passenger trying to catch a routine government flight was transformed back into Colonel Frank Morrison, mission commander for an operation that could determine the future of American intelligence capabilities. The briefcase that had attracted curious attention from TSA Agent Martinez just hours earlier now contained the reference materials for a classified mission that would take Frank Morrison back into the kind of high-stakes environment he'd left behind forever. But as he reviewed operational charts and began planning for a search that would test every limit of aircraft performance and human endurance, he felt the familiar surge of purpose that had defined the best moments of his military career. Outside the aircraft's windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its vast expanse concealing secrets that only Frank Morrison had the experience and expertise to recover. The mission ahead would be dangerous, the odds of success uncertain, and the consequences of failure catastrophic. But for the first time in 15 years, Colonel Frank Morrison was exactly where he belonged, planning a mission that would require everything he had learned about flying, leadership, and the kind of quiet courage that defined true service to country. The elderly man who'd been dismissed by airport security as just another confused passenger was about to demonstrate why the President of the United States had personally diverted Air Force One to collect him. In the vast Pacific Ocean ahead, American aircrew members were depending on his expertise for their lives, and American national security was depending on his leadership for its protection. Frank Morrison had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of mission, even if he'd never expected to fly it under these extraordinary circumstances. The specially equipped C-130 Hercules sat on the tarmac at Hickam Air Force Base like a mechanical predator, its gray camouflage paint scheme designed to blend with ocean skies during low-level flight operations. Frank Morrison approached the aircraft with the measured stride of someone who'd walked up to countless aircraft over the decades, but this time carried the additional weight of command responsibility that he hadn't felt in 15 years. The tropical Hawaiian air was warm against his face, but the urgency of the mission ahead created a tension that made everything feel sharper, more immediate. The crew assembled around the aircraft represented some of the finest aviation specialists the Air Force could provide on short notice. Captain Sarah Rodriguez had been pulled from a training mission to serve as Frank's co-pilot, her experience in long-range Pacific operations making her an ideal choice for the demanding flight ahead. Master Sergeant Kevin Thompson commanded. The specialized search equipment that had been hastily installed in the cargo bay, sensors and communications gear that could detect electronic signatures from hundreds of miles away. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos served as the mission's communications specialist, her responsibility to maintain contact with command authorities while operating in one of the most remote regions of the Pacific Ocean. Technical Sergeant David Park handled navigation and weather analysis, his expertise critical for finding safe passage through the storm systems that were developing across their search area. Each crew member had been selected for specific skills that would be essential for mission success. Frank conducted his pre-flight briefing in the aircraft's cargo bay, surrounded by the electronic equipment that would guide their search efforts. The modified C-130 carried fuel tanks that extended its range to nearly 12 hours of flight time, enough to reach the search area, conduct sustained operations, and return to Hawaii with minimal reserves. The aircraft also carried emergency medical equipment and survival gear, preparations for possibilities that everyone hoped wouldn't become necessary. Our mission is straightforward in concept, but complex in execution, Frank began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd briefed countless dangerous missions over the years. We need to locate a missing SR-91, Aurora reconnaissance aircraft that disappeared approximately 12 hours ago while conducting a classified intelligence mission in international waters. He spread charts across a makeshift table, showing the vast expanse of Pacific Ocean where their search would take place. The area covered nearly 50,000 square miles of open water, far from any land-based navigation aids or emergency landing sites. Weather conditions were already deteriorating, with satellite imagery showing the massive storm system that would make search operations impossible within hours. Captain Rodriguez studied the charts with the methodical attention that characterized experienced military aviators. Colonel, the search area is enormous, and we have limited time before weather shuts us down completely. What intelligence do we have about the aircraft's last known position? Frank opened a classified folder containing the most recent intelligence briefings he'd received aboard Air Force One. The SR-91 was operating under radio silence protocols, so our last confirmed contact was approximately 6 hours into what was planned as a 12-hour mission. Satellite tracking lost the aircraft's signature at this position, he pointed to. Coordinates marked on the chart, but that could mean equipment failure rather than an actual crash. Master Sergeant Thompson examined the specialized search equipment that filled much of the cargo bay. Electronic systems that could detect emergency transponders, aircraft wreckage, or even the electromagnetic signatures of advanced aircraft systems. Sir, if the SR-91 is intact and its crew is alive, our equipment should be able to detect their emergency beacon from a considerable distance. If the aircraft went down, we might pick up debris signatures or residual electronic emissions from the wreckage. The technical capabilities were impressive, but Frank understood that technology alone wouldn't guarantee mission success. The Pacific Ocean was vast, weather conditions were worsening, and they were racing against time to find evidence of an aircraft that had been designed to avoid detection. Success would require not just advanced equipment, but also the kind of operational intuition that came from decades of experience in similar environments. Staff Sergeant Santos reviewed her communications equipment, ensuring that they would maintain contact with command authorities throughout the mission. Colonel, I've established primary and backup communication channels with both Hawaii and Washington. If we locate the missing aircraft, I can coordinate rescue assets or provide real-time intelligence updates as the situation develops. Frank nodded, appreciating the professionalism and competence of the crew that had been assembled for this critical mission. Each specialist understood their role and had the experience necessary to perform under the demanding conditions they would face. But he also understood that leadership during crisis situations required more than technical competence. It required the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure and maintain crew cohesion when facing uncertainty and danger. Technical Sergeant Park spread weather charts across the table, showing the storm system that was rapidly approaching their search area. "Sir, current forecasts give us approximately 4 hours of marginal search conditions before weather forces us to abort operations. After that, we're looking at sustained winds over 60 knots and wave heights exceeding 20 feet, conditions that would make any surface rescue extremely dangerous." The weather forecast confirmed Frank's assessment that this mission would be a race against time. 4 hours to search 50,000 square miles of ocean for an aircraft that might be intact, might be debris, or might have disappeared entirely. The odds weren't encouraging, but Frank had flown enough challenging missions to understand that success often depended on factors that couldn't be quantified in briefing materials. As the crew completed their pre-flight preparations, Frank walked around the C-130 Hercules, conducting the visual inspection that had become automatic after thousands of hours of flight time. The aircraft showed signs of hasty modification, with additional equipment pods mounted under the wings and satellite communication antennas that hadn't been part of the original design. Every modification represented capabilities that would be essential for the mission ahead. The engine started with the familiar turboprop whine that Frank remembered from countless 100 to 130 operations throughout his career. The aircraft systems came online systematically, each crew member completing checklist items that would ensure reliable operation during the long flight ahead. Frank settled into the left seat, his hands finding familiar positions on controls that he hadn't operated in years, but which felt immediately comfortable. Captain Rodriguez completed the co-pilot checklist with smooth efficiency, her movements reflecting extensive experience in the C-130 and familiarity with the demanding conditions of Pacific flight operations. "All systems show green, Colonel. We're ready for taxi and takeoff when you give the word." Frank contacted Hickam Tower for departure clearance, receiving priority routing that would take them directly toward the search area without the delays that normally characterize civilian air traffic control. The tower controller's voice carried the crisp professionalism of someone who understood the urgency of their mission without needing to know specific details about their destination or purpose. The takeoff was smooth and purposeful, the heavily loaded C-130 climbing steadily into tropical skies that showed no hint of the weather system developing hundreds of miles to the west. Frank felt the familiar satisfaction of aircraft responding precisely to control inputs. The mechanical precision that made powered flight possible combined with the human judgment that made complex missions successful. As they climbed toward their cruise altitude, Frank reviewed the mission parameters one more time. The missing SR-91 Aurora represented technology that couldn't be allowed to fall into hostile hands, and its crew included some of America's most highly trained reconnaissance specialists. Recovering both the aircraft and its crew would require not just finding them but also coordinating whatever rescue assets might be necessary to extract them from one of the most remote locations on Earth. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its blue surface showing no hint of the drama that was unfolding above it. Somewhere in that vast expanse, American aircrew members were either awaiting rescue or beyond help, and technology critical to national security was either recoverable or lost forever. The next few hours would determine which of those possibilities became reality. Master Sergeant Thompson activated the search equipment as they approached the designated search area. Electronic systems that began scanning radio frequencies and analyzing electromagnetic signatures for any trace of the missing aircraft. The equipment represented the most advanced search technology available, but Frank understood that finding a missing aircraft in the Pacific Ocean would require more than advanced sensors. It would require the kind of operational experience that allowed him to think like the missing aircrew and anticipate their actions under emergency conditions. The first sweep of the search area revealed nothing but empty ocean, wave patterns disturbed only by the increasing wind that marked the approaching storm system. Frank adjusted their search pattern, drawing on decades of experience to focus. Their limited time on the area is most likely to yield results. The SR-91's mission profile would have taken it along specific routes, and emergency procedures would have directed the crew toward predetermined rally points if they encountered difficulties. Captain Rodriguez monitored weather conditions as they continued their search, her reports growing increasingly concerning as the storm system advanced faster than forecasts had predicted. "Colonel, we're seeing sustained winds approaching 40 knots in the outer search areas. If conditions continue to deteriorate at this rate, we'll need to consider aborting the mission earlier than planned." Frank understood the implications of the weather report, but wasn't ready to abandon the search effort. The missing aircrew had been depending on rescue operations for over 12 hours, and this might represent their last realistic chance for recovery before conditions made further search attempts impossible. He continued the methodical pattern that would give them the best chance of detecting any trace of the missing aircraft. Then Master Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled over the intercom with the first encouraging news of the mission. "Colonel, I'm picking up a faint emergency transponder signal bearing 270 degrees. Approximately 40 miles from our current position. The signal is weak and intermittent, but it's definitely an American military emergency beacon." Frank immediately adjusted their heading toward the transponder signal, the first concrete evidence that their search might yield results. An emergency beacon could mean a crew in survival rafts, aircraft wreckage with automated distress equipment, or even an intact aircraft operating under emergency power. Any of those possibilities represented hope for mission success. As they approached the beacon's location, the ocean below them revealed signs of debris scattered across several square miles of water. Frank descended to a lower altitude for better visibility, the modified C-130 handling smoothly despite the increasing turbulence from the approaching storm system. Through the aircraft's windows, they could see pieces of what appeared to be aircraft wreckage floating among the whitecaps. Staff Sergeant Santos established radio contact with rescue coordination centers, providing position reports and preliminary assessments of what they'd discovered. "Hickam Rescue, this is Search 77. We have located debris field at coordinates provided. Debris appears consistent with military aircraft. We are continuing search for survivors." The debris field told a story that Frank read with the expertise of someone who'd investigated countless aircraft accidents throughout his career. The wreckage pattern suggested that the SR-91 had experienced catastrophic failure at altitude, possibly from enemy action or mechanical malfunction. But the presence of the emergency beacon indicated that at least some systems had remained functional long enough for the crew to activate distress equipment. Captain Rodriguez spotted movement in the water near the largest piece of debris, something that might be a survival raft or aircrew in the water. Frank maneuvered the C-130 for a closer look, maintaining safe altitude while trying to determine whether they'd found survivors or just wreckage moving in the increasingly heavy seas. Then they saw them, two figures in bright orange survival suits, waving from a life raft that was barely visible among the ocean swells. The missing crew of the SR-91 Aurora was alive, but their survival depended entirely on rescue operations that would have to be conducted in deteriorating weather conditions that made such operations extremely dangerous. Frank immediately contacted Rescue Coordination, providing precise coordinates for the survivors and requesting immediate deployment of rescue assets. But the nearest Coast Guard helicopter was hours away, and weather conditions were approaching the limits of safe rescue operations. If the aircrew was going to be saved, it would require creative solutions and calculated risks that tested every limit of aircraft performance and human endurance. The next hour became a carefully orchestrated rescue operation conducted in conditions that would have grounded less experienced crews. Frank maintained station over the survivors while coordinating with rescue assets, providing navigation assistance and weather updates that allowed approaching aircraft to find the precise location. Despite deteriorating visibility, when the rescue helicopter finally arrived, its crew worked with the precision of specialists who understood that they had only minutes to complete the operation before weather forced them to abort. The survivors were lifted from their life raft in an operation that tested every limit of helicopter performance, but both aircrew members were recovered alive and in relatively good condition. As they turned toward Hawaii with the knowledge that their mission had succeeded, Frank felt the satisfaction that came from completing operations that mattered. The technology aboard the missing SR-91 had been lost, but its crew had been saved. And intelligence about the aircraft's fate would help prevent similar losses in the future. It was the kind of outcome that justified the risks and effort that complex rescue operations required. The flight back to Hawaii was a time for reflection. On a mission that had tested skills Frank thought he'd left behind years earlier. But it had also reminded him why he'd chosen a career in military aviation and why service to country sometimes required accepting risks that others couldn't or wouldn't take. The elderly man who'd been questioned by airport security that morning had proven that expertise and dedication transcended age and appearances. As they approached Hickam Air Force Base with the rescued aircrew safely aboard a following helicopter, Frank understood that this mission represented both an ending and a beginning. His retirement from active duty would continue, but he would always be available when his country needed the specific expertise that only he could provide. Sometimes service meant staying ready for the call that might never come, and sometimes it meant answering that call when it finally did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.